Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. My name is Joe Thomas. Thank you for joining us this week, and it was an honor to bring you so much coverage of our adventures at CPAC this past year. And joining us now to kick in a new week is actually the third time in about 4 weeks we've had somebody from the Heartland Institute on the program and the great work that they do there. Joining us here is the Director of Government Relations, George Jamerson. George, welcome to Freedom and Prosperity Radio. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Not at all. So let's get into the story that has been part and parcel, and I guess it's been buried in the Green New Deal discussion, is a lot of places are going their own way with cap and trade. And it is interesting to follow this story of the regional greenhouse gas initiative, but this isn't new agenda item. This has been around for a few years, going back to the great old days of cap and trade and the Chicago Climate Exchange. Explain first and foremost to our listeners what the regional greenhouse gas initiative is and what the Virginia General Assembly is trying to get Governor Northam and subsequent governors to be prohibited from doing.
So the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, otherwise known as Reggie, is pretty much it's an interstate cap and trade program that's made up of New England states, along with New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland. And the idea behind Reggie is it's just cap and trade, but it has sort of the illusion of this sort of coalition alliance together. But the whole point of it is just to create a cap and trade program like they've done in other states, specifically California, that's going to establish a specific amount of carbon dioxide that businesses may produce, and then making them purchase additional allowances from other organizations that haven't used their full production allowance. Mm-hmm. And regarding what's been going on with Virginia as to Reggie and cap and trade is that the legislature this past session passed a bill saying that the governor nor any state organization can pretty much unilaterally put Virginia into Reggie without getting two-thirds consent in both the House and Senate. Now, of course, Governor Northam has pretty much insinuated that he's going to veto this and basically put Virginia into this sort of Reggie-light program.
Do they have the support? I know with a deeply divided House and Senate, 51-49 and 21-19, that it certainly doesn't seem like there's a veto-proof coalition that could avoid this, or is there? Are there common sense Democrats that would join along with the Republicans? One would presume would be all for this, or is this going to just be his veto and wash, rinse, and repeat?
I mean, if you look at the votes on this bill, it was party line vote. I think that one Democrat voted for this. So you're looking at a completely party line vote. So there's really nothing that the legislature can do to try and stop what the governor plans to do.
Is this also a taxing scheme? I've seen some reports that in especially some of the New England states, not only do you have to buy, but then eventually the state takes over the exchange. So it really just becomes a backdoor way to create a tax for existence of these businesses or any business. And then I was reading one report that said Maine actually has a program where you can apply for abatements if you are, I guess, anointed with the right kind of business the state will use, and not wholly unlike any taxing scheme that the state comes up with. Do it we want, when we want it, where we want it, and we'll cut you a deal. Otherwise, you're going to pay full freight, if not more.
Right. So, cap and trade schemes are really nothing more than Trojan horse regressive taxes. Mm-hmm. When you talk about transparency in taxes, right, if you have, like a gas tax, right, it's pretty transparent what it is. It's very direct. It's consistent.
Mm-hmm.
It's bad, but it's consistent. With cap and trade, it's sort of very non-transparent in what they're trying to do. Is basically what they do is they'll set it up in a way that you have to, every single year, right, those emission levels in which they've set a cap on are going to decrease. And the price in which you have to purchase allowances is going to increase. So if you look at the proposal here in Virginia, it basically has a chart in terms of what the trigger price is every single year over the next 10 years. So at the end of the day, the people who are going to really be impacted the most, because supporters of cap and trade programs always say this, and they always kind of say it as a opposition to, oh no, like it's not a tax on the consumer. Yeah. They say it's going to fall on the companies and the corporations. Well, if you have a company such as in Virginia, Dominion Energy, if they're having to purchase extra allowances that's costing them more for power generation, the next step is, 2 plus 2. Who does that fall on to make up the cost right there? It's the ratepayers.
And it's been made the argument, well, they don't have to do that, or couldn't we just, especially in the case of a Dominion or a utility, couldn't the government prohibit that? Well, then you wind up with poorer service and more unemployment because then they find the costs somewhere else within the organization. They'll cut staff, they'll cut safety measures. I mean, you begin... you open a Pandora's box in either case. One is sort of the Venezuela model, will force everyone to increase wages and then, invoke price controls. And certainly with a Dominion, with the state authorizations, they could do that. But you wind up then causing massive unemployment and incredibly bad safety and oversight measures. And in all cases, it winds up hurting the poorest. As I think you mentioned, regressive taxes are always going to be the ones that the people least able to afford the extra costs of these, whether it be electricity or water or you name it, they're going to be the ones picking up the largest percentage of their take-home pay with these costs.
Right, and especially if you look at a program such as California, who's kind of been the poster child for cap and trade, is that what their program has done, and basically theirs was a cap and trade their own cap and trade was to basically a renewable mandate, and their program basically forced 1 million California households to spend at least 10% of their household income on energy costs, and now experts are calling this energy poverty. So the more that you increase these prices for power generation, which is what cap and trade is supposed to do. That's the whole point of it, is to increase the cost of fossil fuel generation so it prices it out of the market. Well, the people who are the lowest income around a state are going to be the most affected. So their income now is going to be increasingly spent on utility costs.
Now, when you talk about utility costs, George, I was reading a piece that it talked about how much a Virginia ratepayer would, see in an increase. What are some of the comparisons where states have adopted Reggie? What kind of history do we have from these states in the 6 or 7 years that some of these states have been doing this? What are the electric bills look like?
Well. And I mean that's a good point to make. Is essentially what does Virginia get out of this? Do the Reggie states have lower emissions? Do they have lower prices in electricity? And the answer is no. Their Reggie states and the 10 Reggie states, they're generally electricity prices are 39% higher than U.S. average.
Holy cow!
And Virginia right now is sitting at about 12% lower, which is pretty good. And that's not even mentioning the fact that in those Reggie states that the emission reduction has been negligible to none, and the studies have shown that they've been in line with national trends, because obviously with the fracking revolution, emissions have been decreasing steadily across the country.
So we're going to pay a lot. Are we going to get a lot out of it? I mean, is the air going to all of a sudden be that much more noticeably? You said almost 40%. Is the air and water going to be 40% cleaner, George?
No.
Oh,
No, and
of course
it's not. And that's sort of the whole that's the whole Trojan horse that they're trying to pull. They're trying to pull this and say that it's going to reduce emissions, but all the studies have shown that these cap and trade programs do not reduce emissions at all. What they do is what they actually end up doing is they don't reduce emissions. They increase electricity costs for individuals, and also you got to think that with that power generation increased cost, that's going to harm also energy-intensive industries. So beyond the fact of this is going to increase individuals' electricity rates, it's also going to increase prices as well for other industries that are being negatively affected by this.
It's as typically always, the best intentions, worst outcomes, it seems. We're visiting with George Jamerson. He's the Director of Government Relations at the Heartland Institute. Elections having consequences, George. I think that's something you and I can, and many of the listeners would agree on. These are the things that when you see a big push to flip 14 seats in the Virginia General Assembly 2 years ago, you say, well, what's behind that? Was it just the guns? But not so much George Soros, but Michael Bloomberg certainly put a lot in there. Tom Steyer's organizations also built on green agenda items, threw tons of money into Virginia's races 2 years ago and are threatening millions upon millions more for House seats that are part-time positions. But when these laws come about, you certainly can see why they're so important to spend millions of dollars on winning a job that pays you, $25,000 a year.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe that Tom Steyer's group, Next Gen America, was the biggest contributor, one of the biggest contributors to Ralph Northam's gubernatorial race.
Oh yeah, well that too. That's it.
I mean, it's pretty convenient right there.
Yeah, you catch yourself red-faced or black-faced or something like that. So
and speaking of Governor Northam, I mean, the big irony here is that he is obviously engulfed in scandal right now, and I just happen to find it ironic that the community that he is trying to win back approval from is with this executive order to put us in Reggie. That is the community that he would hurt the most financially.
Right. It is the poorest. It's the least apt to be able to pick up these extra costs. What about jobs? I mean, is this, as we have said over the time, cap and trade, George, a job killer as well in these states that have picked up this Reggie agenda?
So if you look at, and especially within Virginia, right? So when you look at a lot of Reggie states, prior to even joining Reggie, a lot of these are small states that already had not very much emissions because they just didn't have a lot of output, the same as Virginia does. When you look at the amount of plants that Virginia has and that Virginia has, most of the plants, if you talk to anyone, they're going to tell you that with the cap in Virginia, which would be around, I believe, 28 megawatts. So generally in Reggie, it's 25 megawatts, but in Virginia, it would be leading us into that. So it'd be 28 megawatts. There are very few power plants that will fit that. And so pretty much every single power plant is going to automatically start having to purchase emissions. And over time, as you see, what's going to happen is that it's going to cost too much in order to operate that power plant, which once again is the whole point of this cap and trade program. So over the course of 10 years, you're going to see power plants close. You're going to see jobs be lost. I mean, just look at areas such as Southwest Virginia and areas around there and see how devastated they are economically from what has happened to a plant closure.
And as a job creator and an Adam Smith devotee, I find this yet another way to centralize industry. Certainly an Amazon or a Walmart or any of those companies can absorb these extra costs more easily than a startup that might try to challenge them on some level, or even another company, an auto parts distributor or a mechanic shop is going to say, I can't do that. I can't create jobs. I can't start my own plumbing company. I can't afford the extra cost that it's going to hit me with, because you're already talking about businesses that are right on a razor's edge margin, aren't we, George?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's another issue, to say that it doesn't just affect the individual, is that, putting these type of caps in here is going to affect small businesses primarily. They're not going to really be able to get off the ground. And of course, the real big thing here is, once again, it's very much, this is all really a part of, the old Obama era mindset of, we're going to pick winners and losers here.
Yeah.
Because that's exactly what it is. I mean, the State Corporation Commission is the one that they testified before the legislature, and they made it very clear what it is. I'm reading the testimony right here, and of course they are just being very direct, is that Reggie compliance increases the dispatch cost of fossil fuel generation, thereby making it less competitive. That's just right there. That is their very blatant,
right,
unbiased statement of what it does. It's to make fossil fuel generation and fossil fuels less competitive, to try and prop up renewables,
which still are inefficient, and whether they're propped up or not, don't generate nearly the amount of energy. And at the end of this, we can spend other time later on talking about the other parts of the green agenda, which are population control and that kind of thing.
Sure.
But after all of this is said and done, George, when Virginia does this to itself, self-inflicted, we're going to be poorer. We're going to, and I see other things that are going to come after our prosperity. When people talk abstractedly about states' rights and the incubators of democracy, and allow the states to determine their health care plans and those sorts of things, it all sounds well and good, but here's instances where states have said, okay, carbon cap and trade and the Chicago Climate Exchange failed, but we'll pick it up and we have the states' rights to do it, and it becomes very easy to see how a state could be turned this kind of indigo blue in a very big hurry.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. And, especially when it comes to, the issue of, states kind of taking it upon themselves to sort of continue the clean power plan, that Obama said, and basically buck, the federal agenda of the president to try and decrease these regulations. And they're saying, no, you know what, we're going to go on our own and increase the regulations. It's very similar to after the repeal of the Title II regulations, telecommunications industry, that a bunch of states were like, no, we're going to have our own. You also come across issues where the states' rights argument can be questioned. For example, like if you look at, say, a Washington state, right? They've put so many regulations onto their plants in terms of their transport terminals, on the amount that you can transport by rail, that essentially all of these states, right, that have to go through Washington, if they want to take Bakken oil through Washington and get it down to California, is becoming almost impossible. It's becoming harder to do it. They're seeing a lawsuit actually that says that they're violating the Commerce Clause, and there's a pretty good argument there why.
That's an interesting, I hadn't even thought about that, but yeah, by making it so expensive to get anything through a state, it sort of goes back to the root of the Commerce Clause, which were states were taxing their neighbors to make their own industries more competitive, and the original meaning of the word regulate was to keep regular. This Pandora's box of government regulation, I'm sure at some point the electric companies like Dominion thought it was a cool idea that the government would oversee, and then they'd be held and they would guarantee a number of businesses. But are they having their comeuppance now and seeing that, getting in bed with the government may have been a whole lot of laughs for a few years, but now it's turning on them?
I think that when you look at companies such as, say, Dominion or any energy companies, it really does kind of the chickens come home to roost at some point. Like the renewable mandates are coming through, and at the end of the day, something like Reggie or cap and trade is going to hurt.
I mean, I'm reading a police
big energy companies.
I'm reading here about California, and their gasoline prices alone are 73 cents, could be 73 cents more per gallon within just a few years of this legislative analysis office, and it's already 63 cents more than other states. So at some point, people just start leaving.
Right, and I mean we've seen the mass exodus that's kind of happening out in California, where people are leaving, and one of their biggest destinations is Texas.
Jeez, it is amazing to me, and there's a place where they've even deregulated the electric industry, which I think saves some of these electric companies from this stuff. And of course, as we said, it does not do anything to clean up the air or anything like that. That they actually have found very negligible change in the cap and trade sorts of things. It just becomes another, really, a revenue stream for the government. I was reading something that subsidies have been put into place in Massachusetts for those who struggle with higher electric bills. So it's like it's coming in one end and going out the other because now they have to pay the subsidies to the poor communities that can't afford the higher electric bills. It seems almost, Munchausian, George.
Yes, it's going to be an extremely expensive program for the state of Virginia. And especially over the course of 10 years, it's just going to get more and more expensive with, really what's going to create a sort of a windfall for the state.
In conclusion, is this something that needs to be a campaign issue for all the House of Delegates and state Senate seats? Every seat in our General Assembly is up for election this year, George. So is this something that each and every one of these candidates has to answer for?
Yeah, I think that candidates in the Commonwealth, and especially Republicans, they need to stand up for this, right? Like Republican and conservative candidates need to stand up for conservative principles. And I've been generally disappointed in what I've seen from, as actually I am a Virginia native, and so I've been somewhat disappointed. I mean, obviously with Medicaid expansion being passed, it was, kind of stand up for conservative principles. I think that, Republicans need to stand up to this type of situation that the governor is doing and saying, as conservatives, as Republicans, we are against this and we are for market freedom. We are for energy freedom. We're for consumer freedom. You have to. They need to sort of, forget this whole, is it going to hurt me in the election? Is it going to cost me the election? Well, you need to stand up for consumer freedom. You need to stand up for the principles of economic freedom.
It's the only way forward, and it's even better for the ecology, not just the economy. George Jamerson of the Heartland Institute, one of our favorite groups. Keep doing what you're doing, and best to all there, and we will talk to you again very soon.
All right. Thank you so much.
Up next, we will get into that with candidates for Virginia's General Assembly on this week's Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Welcome back to Freedom and Prosperity Radio, and joining us now on the Newsmakers line from the U.S. House of Representatives, where he's one of the sponsors of the Notify ICE Act, 6th District Congressman. I'm still stumbling over this because it's almost automatic to say Bob Goodlatte, but 6th District Congressman Ben Cline is on the line with us. Ben, how are you doing, sir?
I'm doing great, Joe. Most people stumble when they're used to calling me Delegate Ben Cline, so they're having trouble with the title. But I understand Bob Goodlatte was congressman for so long, that comes naturally.
Well, I have to appreciate the fact that every time I see you in a picture, you're still smiling. So Washington hasn't worn that out of you yet. So we appreciate that very much, Ben. This is ripped right from local headlines. I don't know how many prisons in Virginia, but I know certainly Central Virginia, the Charlottesville-Albemarle Regional Jail is continuing to kick the issue down the road. Every quarter, they seem to bring up the idea that they may vote to stop informing the Immigrations and Customs authorities if they have a criminal detainer of an illegal immigrant. Your bill seeks to address that on a federal level, Ben. Tell us about it.
Well, it does, and it comes from my experience as a prosecutor where, yes, we have folks who are charged with crimes and then convicted in court, and we notify ICE to come and pick them up and so they can deport them quickly under what used to be a 287G agreement with the locality. And there are lots of ways that ICE can learn about whether someone is there illegally and needs to be deported. My bill is very simple. It just adds to the ways in which ICE can learn about illegally present individuals. When a NICS check, when you try and buy a firearm and you have a background check, if you're here illegally, that's an automatic denial of your right to purchase a firearm. You don't have that right if you're here illegally. And so I'm just asking that NICS notify ICE, one government agency to another, to ensure that those people who are already engaged in illegal behavior aren't given access to a firearm to potentially engage in additionally illegal behavior.
Well, let me ask you this, and this is the overly naive radio show host, Ben. If somebody goes in to try to buy a firearm and they're here illegally or undocumentedly or whatever the politically correct word is for it, why isn't law enforcement notified at that point that there's an undocumented person in my store? Can you come get him or her?
You would think that would be a natural event that would occur. The shop owner would send in the information to NICS, the background check system, and the background check system would send the notification to the proper law enforcement. If you're a felon, local law enforcement should know. If you're here illegally, ICE should know. So these kinds of things don't occur. These common sense measures don't come naturally to government bureaucrats. And so this bill is necessary to make sure that point A and point B are connected in the federal government.
I know that when they talk about not notifying ICE on a local jail level and creating what I refer to as a sanctuary jail, the defense that the progressives lean on is that there's this program, a software called Vine, which is supposed to notify victims of crime or give them the opportunity to keep an eye on those who have victimized them. But everyone from the chief of the jail on down has said this is inefficient. Yet again, it seems like there are people who are playing politics with somebody who has not only committed the original crime of being in this country illegally for however they got here, but now are in a jail with an instance of whether it's an assault or a robbery or some other abrogation of our constitutional rights. Ben, how do they still make their case that this is legit for them to do?
There's no good case to be made for them to claim presence in the country legally, or if they're in the country illegally, that they should be able to remain in the country illegally and shouldn't be deported. And but we seem to have struck a nerve with the other side because my freshman colleagues in the Democratic Party have written to Nancy Pelosi and said, hey, we shouldn't have had to vote on this ICE Notification Act as part of the gun control bill last week. We want you to further restrict the rights of the minority Republicans and not allow them to offer these kinds of amendments anymore.
Oh, my gosh.
It's pretty ridiculous.
It's interesting from a parliamentary procedural level, Ben, that, they'll say the exact same thing, for example, with the president's executive action regarding the border wall. They'll say, well, next time there's a Democrat president, he's going to declare an executive action on, insert whatever it is, gun grabs or anything like that. It seems like if there aren't double standards, there are no standards at all in Washington.
Well, hypocrisy springs eternal in our nation's capital, and it's always there. And right now we see the Democrats who had the ability to offer motions to recommit this parliamentary maneuver that when they were in the minority, they were never successful when Republicans were in the majority. But here now, that the tables have turned. We're offering these motions to recommit with instructions like notifying ICE when an illegal immigrant buys a firearm.
Mm-hmm.
That got 30 Democrat votes. The amendment passed with 220 votes total.
Wow.
And so my standalone bill, I'm arguing, should be brought to the floor because it obviously has enough support to pass the House and should be moving on to the Senate.
What else is in you had mentioned, for example, an illegal immigrant trying to buy a firearm. What other do you get into heavily specific instances where ICE would be notified in this, Ben?
No, it's a very simple bill. It's 1 page, 1.5 pages. It just says that NICS shall notify ICE, give them a list of all those who trigger that paragraph in the law that says you can't purchase a firearm if you're here illegally. Anybody who triggers that section and is rejected in the NICS check that name shall be given to ICE. And I would assume, and I did ask a representative of ICE when they testified before the Judiciary Committee if that would be helpful to them, and they testified that it would be.
Okay, well, I didn't know how often they tried, but bless their hearts for not realizing that maybe you shouldn't try to buy a firearm from a licensed gun dealer if you're not here legally. Through that, could this be expanded in future, Ben, to include other instances where an undocumented, whatever you want to call, tries to do something even up to and including filing tax returns or voting or any place else where citizenship needs to be verified?
I think that's got a lot of potential. I think the more information that ICE has about the activities of people who are here illegally, as long as we give them the resources that they should be engaged in finding and deporting these individuals who are here illegally.
What about border security? Ben Cline, Congressman Ben Cline, the 6th District. Obviously back and forth with whether or not the Senate and the House, bills are going to undo the president's executive order regarding rearranging some of the funds within his defense spending obligations to build the border wall. What ramifications? We hear a lot of people, and I mentioned it earlier, Nancy Pelosi saying, well, the next Democrat will go after abortion clinics or whatever that way. The other direction on that rhetoric could very easily be, the Congress actually getting back to a place where they do control the purse strings. And if all things remain consistent, it's almost as if Congress has woken up and over the last 50 years realized that they've been little by little giving up their control over the purse strings. That can't be a bad thing, can it, Ben?
Well, Congress needs to regain control over its purse strings, and that would start with passing additional legislation to pull back on some of these emergency authorities that they've given to the president. Now, that process is already in law, and the president, to his credit, is just following the code. He's just looking at the section of the law that says when he declares an emergency, and it doesn't define what an emergency is, it leaves it to the president to decide when there's an emergency. It triggers all of these other sections, one of which is the ability to take military construction funding in a very limited fashion and move it over to construction projects in support of the military related to the emergency. So it is very narrow. It is very focused on within military construction, and he has already called the troops to the border. So President Trump has every reason to say under this emergency, which of course I consider it to be an emergency when drugs and human trafficking and sex trafficking and criminals and gang members are pouring over our borders, that he wants to shift some of this money from military construction to construction of a border barrier.
What about some of the other, non-visible barriers? I know your predecessor in the 6th District was always very strong on the idea of E-Verify being part of, quote unquote, a wall where, that wall extends to the hiring table and the human resources departments of places who often are the ones who are driving some of these coyotes to go get, more inexpensive labor and things like that for it. Ben, is there a danger in undoing some of this funding that, we could undo some of those common sense proposals as well?
We actually need more resources on the lawful points of entry. You have those arguing that most of the drugs, a lot of the human trafficking comes over through the lawful points of entry. And I say, let's put more resources to those lawful points of entry, because that's where you do get a lot of the drugs. We need more drones. We need more dogs. We need more scanning. We need more men at that border crossing. But we also need protection along the unmanned border, where whatever form the barrier takes, it keeps people from crossing, because once they're across, then you have a declaration of asylum, a guarantee of a trial. Then they are released into the interior of the country, and that's where they vanish, and we are unable to deport them from that point.
Well, and visa overstays are another one that you and I have talked about in the past as well. Still puzzling after all these years since September 11th. One of the ways that Mohammed Atta and his crew were in the country were visa overstays, and we still haven't grasped that one either, Ben. Is there a real danger of all this open borders, no ICE, no wall rhetoric becoming law, or at least finding their way into some of the laws that the House majority is trying to put forth?
Oh, it absolutely is as close to becoming law at the federal level as a Democrat majority is at the state level. We have one vote majorities in the House and Senate in Virginia's state government, and a Democrat governor waiting to sign liberal legislation into law. At the federal level, they already have the House. They're 3 votes shy in the Senate and 1 presidential election away. So they line this stuff up over the course of years, just as they did getting ready for Obamacare with their health care proposals. And when lightning strikes and they have a supermajority in the Senate and can roll over Republicans, and they have a Democrat in the White House, they'll take advantage and they'll push this stuff through. So I don't take any of it lightly. I take it all seriously. Bernie Sanders got $6 million the first day he declared for president.
Amazing, yeah.
So there's that. I wish I could just dismiss him as a doddering old man with crazy socialist ideas, but unfortunately he's got a following, and we have to combat it through the battle of ideas.
Delegate, you got me, Congressman Ben Cline. See, you tainted the water when you said that earlier. You brought it on. Right. Is on with us here on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Coming into 2019, we've got a lot of influence peddling going on around the General Assembly elections. You mentioned, in the governor's hand is a pen that will probably put us into the Reggie program until the General Assembly can stop it. But we watch guys like Tom Steyer and Michael Bloomberg try to exert more and more power. The General Assembly, bless them, actually took Mark Herring and said you cannot use Michael Bloomberg's foundation money to hire lawyers to do specific climate change work, which was great. But we need to be watching this. What's advice from somebody who's been through all this and now is seeing it from Washington to those who are running either for re-election, new candidates trying to win over or win back seats that had been lost in the last couple of years, Ben, and the importance, maybe underscore the importance of the General Assembly elections this November?
Well, all the money in the world is no substitute for on-the-ground, grassroots, door-knocking, meet and greets, going to the supermarket, going to the Walmart, and just seeing your friends and neighbors and talking to them. Because at the end of the day, people are going to believe their neighbors who tell them, I know that delegate. That delegate's a good person, as opposed to the flyer that comes in the mail that tells them something opposite. And so grassroots is the solution, and I urge my colleagues on our side to stay out there, stay focused. We're going to retake a lot of the seats that flipped in 2017 and regain them in 2019, keep our majorities in the House and Senate, and then be well on the way to the governor's mansion in 2021.
Well, I appreciate your encouragement. You, of course, having walked the entirety of the 6th District, nobody can say, oh, Ben doesn't know what he's talking about. I mean, the 6th Congressional District's a whole lot bigger than any Senate District or House of Delegates District in Virginia.
True.
So
it was a long walk, but I got to know the district ahead of the election, meet a lot of great people.
Last one for you, Ben. How was CPAC and the Liberty events going on there? And do you think they'll do it again? Do you think Reverend Falwell will have everyone back for another satellite CPAC next year?
Well, I sure hope so. I mean, they had thousands of Liberty students there at convocation for the vice president's speech. The vice president's coming to graduation. He's going to be the graduation speaker this year, so he gave a great shout-out from CPAC to the students, and the students roared with approval, and then we had Don Jr., the president's son, on a panel, and he was there with Jerry Falwell Jr., and they had a great discussion. And then I got to participate on a panel with former Congressman Robert Hurt, who I've known for many years, Congressman Denver Riggleman from the 5th, and former Congressman Dave Bratt, who's signed on to be the dean of their School of Business, which is going to be constructed here over the next year.
Well, I bring it up because at the D.C. CPAC, the president said federal research dollars could be taken away from colleges that try to restrict free speech. So do you encourage that sort of thing? It's certainly money, again, like the border wall, he has discretionary Department of Education impact over. Is that a fair thing to try to do? Because we see more and more schools allowing, for thuggery against conservatives while restricting free speech to very limited times of the day in very limited areas.
The violation of the constitutional free speech rights of students is one of the more insidious goals of the left through our university system, and we should use our tools to combat it and to ensure that all students are able to express their own points of view and to hear points of view on a college campus. That's what higher education is all about. And I went to a very liberal undergraduate institution, Bates College up in Maine, and I had a battle of ideas every night at the dining hall table. But it made me a better student, a better debater, and ultimately a better citizen because I could articulate my conservative values better.
Well, you keep writing those 1.5-page bills in Congress, and they're going to think you're the weird guy from Virginia. Where did he learn this conciseness in his bills? But we appreciate your representation. It's bencline.com there, and klein.house.gov for the congressional office as well. And I appreciate it, sir. You have a wonderful day, and thank you for joining us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.
Thanks, Joe.
And thank you for listening as well on behalf of all of us here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. We will see you here next weekend. Until then, so long, and thanks for all the fish. And thanks for all the fish. And thanks for all the fish.